Hey everyone, and welcome to Bright and Early, the podcast for people building early stage startups. I'm your host, Brian Ray. I talk to entrepreneurs, product people, designers, and marketing pros to learn what works, what doesn't, and why, giving you at least one thing to apply to your business first thing tomorrow. My guest today is Ryan Singer. Ryan is head of product strategy at Basecamp, where he has designed features used by millions and invented processes used by their team to design, develop, and ship the right things. He shares many of those processes in his new book, Shape Up, and we'll be discussing that today. Ryan, welcome to Bright and Early.
Hey there, happy to be here.
It's my pleasure. I was telling you before we hit record, I've been following your work for well over a decade, and so this is quite a treat to have you on. So thanks so much.
Sure thing.
So I want to talk about Shape Up. This is only gonna be like 45-minute interview, but there's a solid 20 hours worth of questions and conversation that I would love to ask you about. But the first thing is I want to hear a little bit about your experience. You've been at Basecamp for 16 years?
Yeah, it's been 16 years now.
Yeah. So, and if I have my history right, you started off doing UI design when the company was still a design agency.
Right.
So what was that like in the early days?
It was awesome. I mean, I learned so much at every stage of the company's growth so far. When I first came in, I was just a really big fan of Jason's work. 37 Signals at that time really stood out from the crowd because in the early web design scene, a lot of the design was sort of a very dense graphic design, kind of packed into a little box in the middle of the screen.
Yeah.
And a lot of images that were stitched together, so that you could click on one part of the image and it would be a button, but the rest would be sort of the background around the button, this kind of a thing.
Oh yeah.
And there was a lot of people doing interesting work in that style, but you'd go to 37 Signals website at the time and it was just text. And it was just about the statements that they were making, the values that they had, the opinions they had. And it was much more about how things work instead of how they look, even though they also looked really sharp. But it was a much more sort of usability focused, functionality focused, clarity focused style. At the time, I don't know, who's been around long enough to remember, but I was a big fan of useit.com, Jacob Nielsen's site.
Yes.
He was one of the sort of early proponents of usability when that term, that term meant a lot more at that time because of the context we were in. The web was so graphic and kind of all over the place and so immature that to have somebody trying to say, hey, things should make sense, things should be clear, like, that was actually new. Now it's so seeped into the culture of web design that it's quite normal to see beautiful and really usable, well thought out sites, but that wasn't so much the case at the time.
Yeah.
So I was really admiring Jason's work there, and then when I saw that that he was looking to hire somebody, I reached out and tried to get the job, and it turned out that we were, very like-minded. But he was also ahead of me in a lot of ways, and I learned a ton from working under him on a variety of short projects before we started doing Basecamp.
Yeah. Were you in Chicago already?
Yeah, I was in Chicago at that time.
Okay, got it. So it's interesting talking about the state of web design in the early 2000s and in the mid 90s and whatever, when the concept that a web browser would be able to display an image was just such a revolution, and that was so great. It was such an improvement. It matured to the point where it started to affect usability. Right. Are there things that you see now in web design, given your experience, that technologically huge advancement, great that we can do that, but that are being overused and are actually starting to negatively affect what people like us do for a living?
I'm not sure. I would say I'm sure there's things that we could point out that are problems with web design today. But the main thing for me, just because of where I come from, when I look at the web today, I'm just blown away by. I'm just blown away. The level of graphic design, the level of technical engineering, it's just incredible. every corner you turn, when you look at a really properly professionally produced site, it's just incredible the amount of skill and expertise that's been integrated together to do that. And it's so far ahead of stuff that I was doing when I was learning, years ago. And I didn't stay in the field of what's the new HTML CSS technique. I didn't stay there. My interests kept moving. I
Mhm.
moved from being interested in web design to sort of web UI plus programming to product to strategy, and then occasionally dipping back, again. But for people who have actually stayed in the weeds of what's technically possible and how to do things better. I mean, like, we have a marketing designer named Adam, for example, and Adam's work is I mean, it's not only 10x, it's like 100x better than what I could do if I were tasked with the same thing, because he has so much more skill, down in the details of all that type of work.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really fascinating. Well, I want to talk about Shape Up,
Hmm.
because it has, like, predictably, I think it's fair to say, made a quite a splash in design development circles that we run in. So congratulations! Like, is a fantastic work.
Thanks a lot.
But so yeah, of course. So for listeners who maybe haven't read it just yet, can you give just the quick gist, like the key idea that you were hoping to share in writing it?
Yeah. Shape Up is born out of our 15 plus years of trial and error, figuring out how to do product development for Basecamp. And uh, it the book is sort of two things in one. On the one hand, it's a handful of specific practices that we use. So these are sort of the phases of the work that we go through to go from raw idea to something that we can schedule, to something that's getting built, to something that ships.
Mhm.
But at the same time, and actually more importantly, the book is also spelling out what we think are some basic facts about the universe. So,
What do you mean by that?
well, whether or not you work in exactly 6 weeks, like we talk about in the book, or whether or not you write a pitch with the 5 points that we recommend to include in a pitch when you're
Yes.
presenting a possible project to bet resources on, for example, the underlying key points are about truths about work that you can't get around. Um, if you want to make an omelet starts with raw eggs, and there's a million ways to make an omelet, but that's just a fact, right? And in the same way, work that a team builds, projects that teams take on, they start with raw ideas. They start with unshaped, hey, maybe we should do that. Hey, the CEO had this idea in the shower yesterday. Customers are requesting this. We got this feature request from sales. Like, these inputs come in, and they're not actually ready to bet on until we do something more to them to clarify what they are, to define what they are and what they're not, to set bounds and expectations on them, so
Mhm.
that if we are to delegate that work to a couple people to go execute, that we know what they're executing, they know what they're executing, and everybody has some confidence that we're really going to release more or less what we wanted at the end of a time period that we schedule for it,
Right.
and
Right.
we don't just get that by magic. And we've seen different extremes of how to deal with that over time. There's been the sort of waterfall extreme of, let's specify every little detail of what this thing needs to be up front, which is too concrete. And that doesn't work because you don't know all the details up front of how to really put it together down to the tiniest detail. So that blows up in your face. And all the things you think you had to do turn out to be different than what you really have to do once you get your hands dirty, right? That's
Right.
another fact of the universe. We don't
Right.
know up front when we're working with something that is a novel problem that we haven't exactly solved before, and there's interdependencies in the problem that we can't quite see in advance, there's going to be surprises, right?
Mhm.
So we
Mhm.
can't over specify the solution up front. Then on the other hand, there's the other extreme of what agile turned into, which is, we don't know anything, let's just let the team figure it out and hope for the best, and then just swing at it 2 weeks at a time, and eventually we'll figure something out, right?
Right.
And that's not strategic.
Mm.
it's true that you don't really know in advance, so it's good to give, more room to change course. But at the same time, if you're making an investment, you have to know what you're investing in and what you're pursuing and why you're doing this instead of something else and what you're going to get out of that investment.
Right.
So if we just say, hey, go build this feature and figure out what it really is, by sprinting at it or whatever, then we're being too abstract. We're being too fuzzy about what it is. So this word shaping refers to the work that we do on a raw idea to reduce our risk and increase our clarity by setting boundaries around it and figuring out kind of what the key points of the solution are, while still leaving enough latitude inside of it for the team to work out the details.
Yes.
So it's a
Yeah.
level of roughness and a level of abstraction where we are getting clear about what the work is, and we're thinking harder about what the work is before we get to the point of doing real design and doing, real programming.
Hmm.
And then the outcome of shaping is that we have some work that we could potentially bet on. So now we have some work that we have better odds of success. And especially when we talk about betting, we have this notion of this applies to both the shaping and the betting process. We have what we call an appetite. So an estimate is where you start with a design and then you say, how long is it going to take to do that? Right. So you start with a design and then you get to a number. An
Yep.
appetite is where you flip that around. You start with a number and then you go to a design. So you say, how much time is this worth to us strategically? So there might be something that comes up that's worth doing, but it's only worth 2 weeks of everybody's time. It's not worth an 8-week project, right? And
Yes.
so in that case, if you can declare that up front, then you're setting some boundaries on the design process, and you're creating a situation where people who are downstream from that, who are going to do the work, are going to have to make trade-offs in order to get that thing done, different trade-offs than they would make otherwise. And what I mean by trade-offs is, a steak might be better than a hot dog in terms of a quality meal, right?
Yes.
But
It's
if you
better
only have
food.
5 minutes,
Yep.
if you only have 5 minutes, a hot dog is better than a steak,
Right.
right? So the
Right.
constraints totally change the definition of value and what's good and what's bad, right?
Hmm.
So the outcome of the shaping process is that we have a potential bet that fits within the appetite for what we think this thing is strategically worth. And now we can look at this potential bet and say, do we have the right people around? Is this the right time? Is this something that we want to do or not? Have we shaped it sufficiently to remove enough of the risks that we can manage? You can never eliminate all of the risk, but have we done our best to improve our odds so that when we make the bet that we're successful? And then that really comes into how is betting different than planning, and how is it different than just sort of scheduling time and pecking away at something one sprint after another? When you make a bet has a capped downside. If you say, I'm going to bet $100 that this thing happens, the most you
That's
lose
the
is a
most
hundred
you'll lose.
dollars,
Yes.
right?
Yep.
And that's the logic of the whole thing, right? We want to have the exact same logic apply to our scheduling and our resource allocation. So if we say this particular feature or this particular improvement is worth 6 weeks of a team's time, and that team is, let's say, a designer and two programmers, we're making that upfront as this is how much we're willing to commit to get this outcome.
Hmm.
If that thing starts to get out of control, or it turns out to be more complicated than you thought, or something goes sideways on the project, that doesn't mean that that project starts to become worth more, right? So it doesn't make sense to automatically increase your cost and increase your commitment just because it got harder. The fact that it got harder and the cost got higher doesn't change the value at all. So we have this thing we call the circuit breaker,
Right.
and that means that if a team for some reason doesn't successfully ship and deploy that piece of work that was shaped and bet on for that period of time, then by default it's canceled. By default it's just over, and it
As
didn't
opposed to the
happen.
traditional default, which is to extend more time to it.
just throwing bad money after bad money after bad money,
Right.
you know,
Right.
and that's or you know, in this case, I guess throwing bad time after bad time, right?
Hmm.
And what we want to do instead is we want to say, look, we shaped this to get very clear about what we were doing and what we're not doing, and also, by the way, when we give work to a team, we leave them alone. So another aspect of betting is that when you make a bet, you honor it,
Yes.
right? And so if you bet that these people are going to work on this thing for 6 weeks, then you leave them alone. You don't pull them away to do something else. You don't interrupt them and say, hey, just this one thing, because not only do you lose the time that you pulled them away for, you lose the momentum that they had built up, and you lose the time it takes them to spin up that momentum again.
Yeah.
You know,
And future belief that that commitment will be honored and that they know when they start to work on something, they will
great
continue
point. The
to, yeah.
credibility too, right?
Credibility. Yeah. Yep.
Absolutely. So instead, we say, look, we did everything we could do to create the best conditions for success. We left the team alone, and then at the end of the 6 weeks, something didn't go the way we thought it was going to. So now the solution is drop the project, do something else in the next 6 weeks that we have better confidence in,
Hmm.
and then if we still think that thing, if we really wish that that thing had happened, even though we didn't get it done in the amount of time, then we can have a new conversation, a new betting conversation about, well, actually, it would be worth it if we could give it more time.
Hmm.
But then before we make that commitment, we should reshape that work because something was wrong,
Something was off. Yeah.
right? And we have to be able to debug that. And that's where we get into part 3 of the book, where we have the different practices for how a team can be successful when you leave them alone and you give them more autonomy and you task them with sort of self-managing the execution.
Yes.
And here, the number one difference is that we don't give the team tasks. So I talk a little bit in the book about the paper shredder. So the traditional approach in Scrum teams and stuff like that is that somebody turns the work into tasks, and those tasks or stories or cards or whatever
Whatever you call
get
them.
get slotted into some kind of a sprint, and then the team is basically pecking away at a queue of things they're supposed to do. And this is sort of the code monkey grunt work type of a scenario. It's not good for morale, and it's not good for successfully completing the project, because you put the project through a paper shredder. Now you have to hope that all the little strands glue together again and make sense in the end,
Hmm.
right? But you didn't have the full information in the beginning, as we talked about.
Right.
So what we're doing instead of that is we're giving the team, instead of giving them tasks, we give them the whole project, and they discover the tasks and capture the tasks and track the
Hmm.
tasks, because they're the ones who are actually have their hands down in the system, and they have the hood open, and they're figuring out what's connected to what, and what's actually
Yeah.
going to work, you
Yep.
know.
Yep.
And then the final piece there is that the in order to talk about progress and to talk about whether we're on the right track or not, we don't look at what's complete and what's incomplete. We look at what's known and what's unknown, because it's the unknowns that sink a project. If you have something that's a known and it's just taking a little longer than you thought, but there's nothing unsolved about it, it's just labor, then no problem. You stay up a little later, or you throw an extra day at it, or you give it an extra week, and everything's fine. If there's something that comes up in the project that doesn't actually have a clear solution, or people don't know how to do it, now you're in a completely different risk regime. Now it could be 6 weeks before they solve it. It could be another 12 weeks before they solve it. It could be unsolvable. It could require ripping up some other foundation somewhere else because of some, interdependency that's supposed to be external to what's being changed in the project, right?
Right.
So we introduced the language of uphill versus downhill work, using this metaphor of the hill chart. Uphill, where you don't quite see that, you can't see where the top is until you get there,
Hmm.
so you're trying to figure out, how do I do this? What's the right approach? How does this fit together? And then for a given piece of work, you reach that point where you're standing at the top of the hill, and now you can see down the other side. And that feeling of being able to see down the other side, it's a little bit like, that point when you're assembling the IKEA furniture, and you look down, and there's like 6 pieces of wood around, and there's exactly eight holes in there, and you look in your hand, and there's 8 screws in your hand, and you're like,
Yeah.
okay, I know
I
I'm going to be
know.
okay.
Yes. Right.
Because you know what I
Exactly.
mean? But you, in the early phases of the project, it's not like that. It's much more unclear where things are
Yeah.
going to go and how things are going to fit
Right.
together.
There are boards everywhere and piles of screws all over the place.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you
I
don't
love
even
that.
know where to start.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I love that metaphor. So I just I want to summarize that um the phases of your approach of your process are shaping, betting, and building.
Hmm.
And then and you all at Basecamp, you actually you go into some detail in the book, but let's just keep it simple here
Hmm.
that basically there are 6-week cycles, and then a 2-week cool down,
Yep.
and it carries on in that way.
Yep.
And so and you go into each of those stages in depth in the book, and it's described at a perfect level of detail. I want to ask you about appetite, which you mentioned
Hmm.
just a bit ago. That the way that you all, yeah, a key differentiator in your process is that during shaping you determine the appetite first, as
Hmm.
opposed to, as you said, starting with the design and then arriving at an estimate.
Right.
So um, I think a reasonable critique is that it seems like that could result in delivering less than what the customer really needs. Like, it doesn't matter, Ryan, if you don't have the appetite, if you don't feel like spending 3 weeks on it, that's what it will take. And so if I don't like the color of my house, I just can't paint a third of it and then
Mm.
call it done because that's what I have the appetite for.
Mm.
So
Hmm.
how do you balance I think the rational description that you gave for this is why we start with an appetite instead of a
Mm.
design. How do you balance that against, well, sometimes it is going to take that long whether we like it or not. How do you all talk about that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Um, the difference is at the end of the day, you can't ever really escape estimation because you have to be able to say, is this whatever we came up with? Even let's say in the case where we start purely with an appetite of how much time do we want to spend,
Mhm.
and then we come up with some sort of a design for that. We still need to be able to estimate what we designed to see if it's feasible inside of the appetite. So there's
Okay.
no way to get away from estimation. The question, so it's not about estimation is bad. It's about where do we sequence the estimation in our process. So if we start with a design and then we estimate, then the design gets fixed in the beginning. But the thing is that that one design is not the only way to go about solving the problem in the universe,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
So
Okay.
the important thing is we want to put ourselves in a situation where we are able to find more latitude in the design. So I use the example in the book of building a
The
calendar,
calendar. Yeah.
and the calendar is a good example because I just saw a tweet yesterday about some new calendar app, and this calendar app was talking about how it is the very, very best for figuring out where overlap is between two people's schedules. So it was basically saying you don't have to email each other anymore to determine, who's free when and where the overlap is. That alone is an entire product trying to solve that problem,
Mhm.
right? Now there could be another calendar where it's all about I want to have the best month grid view on an iPad, and I want to have the best high fidelity dragging interactions for how I can
Mm.
move something from one day to another.
Yes.
Totally different space, totally different problem set, right?
Right.
Now, if we ask ourselves what is a good calendar, then a good calendar is all of those things,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
But we have to. But then we say, well, strategically, are we a calendar company or not, right? And when we get asked to build a calendar in Basecamp, we knew from the past that a certain percentage of customers ever used the event and scheduling features that we had in past versions. We had some understanding about what we think is driving people to use Basecamp, what problems it's particularly good at solving, et cetera, et cetera. And based on that, we were saying to ourselves, we don't want to spend 6 months again building a calendar because we had done
Mhm.
that in the past on a prior version of Basecamp. And and we believed, this comes back to your question, we believed that it wasn't possible to build a calendar that was any good in under 6 months. So this is a case where we're looking, the customer is saying, I want a calendar.
Hmm.
We're kind of putting an estimate on that and saying, well, I don't think I can do that in less than 6 months. And then we're looking at our appetite and we're saying, we don't want to spend 6 months. So we just didn't do it. We just kept not doing it.
Right.
Then the question kept coming from customers. And so it just kind of
Uh,
bothered me. I didn't feel great about the fact that we weren't doing anything about it.
Yeah.
So I wanted to dig in a little bit deeper. And so a couple of us, Chase from our support team helped with this, did some interviews with customers. And what we discovered was that, as is often the case, when they said, we want a calendar, they didn't mean give me a completely full featured alternative to Google Calendar or Apple Calendar or whatever. This isn't
Right.
what they were asking for. Once we better understood what they were asking for, we had a much more narrow definition of what progress would look like in the circumstance that they were in.
Hmm.
And then we were able to say, there might actually be a smaller version of this. And if we could do this in 6 weeks instead of 6 months, we would actually feel good about spending that time. That's an investment we're okay
Yeah.
with,
Yeah.
right? So then the question became, is there actually a solution in that period of time? And we found one. We found something that we thought was good enough. If you compare it objectively to other calendars by some sort of objective standard, then no, it's not nearly as good as other calendars. But if you compare it to the baseline of what customers had before and what specifically they were struggling with, I think we brought people to a place where they were better off, and we see that in the form of fewer complaints and fewer requests on the
Right.
subject.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, it's well understood and recognized that constraints, having more constraints, often leads to a more creative solution anyway.
Totally.
Yeah.
Totally.
That's interesting. Okay.
Yeah.
That's pretty
And
good.
there
Just.
will be things that come up where you cannot imagine any other version of the thing and it costs what it costs.
Hmm.
That does happen. But that's the exception.
Yeah.
Most of the things that we do in product development are where we get to decide what we're going to build and we make the trade-offs, and we should be more conscious about what trade-offs we're making and
Yeah.
what is really important to this thing and what's not necessary and what's valuable and where we want to spend our time. It just comes back to being
Yeah.
more deliberate about what we spend time on.
Hmm.
This
And
whole thing about agile is that decision making got pushed down from leadership to the team, and this is unhealthy. Leadership wants to say yes to everything, and then they just push it down to the teams, and then the teams are supposed to sprint on it and figure it all out. And what we want to do is we want to take more responsibility at a leadership level for what we're betting on and what we think is strategically valuable. And then we can put the team in a better situation to be successful because they're not constantly crammed with having to build everything and get it done yesterday. You know,
yeah.
it's a really big thing.
Yeah. Okay. That man, there's so much other stuff I want to ask about, but I want to follow up on that because a lot of people would say that pushing or not pushing, um, allowing that decision making to go down to the team has actually been a good thing. That's democratic, inclusive. I feel like I'm part of the company mission, etc. And so to take that away and bring it back up to leadership and say that leadership is going to make those determinations, that might feel like taking away some purpose or autonomy at the developer level.
I think this comes from a misunderstanding of how hard development is. It is so hard to make anything work. Making it work is hard.
Yeah.
Okay. And the programmer's job is mainly to make it work. And making it work is just really, really difficult. And it requires a lot of judgment. So if you are giving the team little fine-grained tasks to do and it's all grunt work because they're just pulling tickets off of a queue, then that is way too far on the end of not enough autonomy.
Yes.
And that's happening in a lot of companies today because of Scrum.
Yeah.
If you go the other way and you say everybody on the team needs to be involved in the decision about what's important to the customer and they all need to understand the customer, that's wrong too, because the team is already tasked with a huge job, which is make it work and figure out how to make it work well and make it make sense,
Hmm.
you know?
Right.
So it's leadership's job to be strategic.
Yeah.
It's leadership's job to steer the company and figure out what's worth doing next.
Hmm. Yeah.
And if
I,
you have more respect for how difficult development is and all the little design decisions that have to be made, then then you give the team room to solve all of the sort of, they're not even small, but they're the local decisions that need to be made when you fill in the shaped work. You give
mhm.
them the boundaries of what to do and what not to do. So like with the calendar, it's less about availability overlap, and it's less about high fidelity interaction, and it's more about being able to identify an open space to schedule a resource.
Right.
You
Well,
know,
and yeah, and I want to follow up on something there too. Is respect for how difficult development is for sure. Um, that and then respect in the other direction as well. Respect for how difficult leadership is and how
exactly.
difficult those decisions are.
It takes
So
time and work to figure out what to do.
yes,
And this
yeah,
is the thing where shaping is such an important idea, because it means that figuring out what the work is work. So if somebody is spending time figuring out what the work is, that's extremely valuable. And
hmm,
today, so many people who are, designers or product managers or product owners or whatever, who are supposed to be figuring out, what the next feature looks like or whatever, if they feel like if they're not building the actual wireframe or they're not building the view, then they're not doing real work. But the thing is, if you skip the work of shaping, then all of your real work is going to produce waste because you haven't thought enough about what's actually the right thing to do.
hmm,
So
yeah,
leadership, we need to value how hard it is also to work out the concept, and talk to customers and look at what's going on competitively and figure out what is the right thing to do now versus later in the year, or maybe never.
hmm,
So that stuff takes time and effort. It's not just arbitrary that you're the boss and therefore you stick your finger in the air and feel the way the wind is blowing and then make a decision today. And I think the more that we frame this in terms of different kinds of work, the more that we can have respect for each other, for the skill set that we bring, and the more that we can set up tracks in terms of our careers. If I'm a designer and I feel a little bit frustrated, moving this to the left and moving this up down and moving it below, and I feel like, figuring out the proportion and making it look right is not totally satisfying, and I'm more curious about, is this the right thing to be building? I could start to think of myself as aspiring to do shaping. And now that I have a word for that, and some place to learn about that, I can say, oh, what is shaping? Oh, shaping is where I integrate more understanding of business strategy, and I integrate a little more knowledge of what's technically feasible, and I bring those together and design it at a different level of abstraction.
hmm,
So now if somebody wants to go down that path, they have an option. And if somebody doesn't feel like that's where they want to go, and they're like, you know what, I actually really enjoy solving that CSS puzzle and figuring out how to get this thing to render properly. And wow, look, it all plugs together and it all works. It's so beautiful. Then that person can go deeper into that role, and we can have mutual respect for the fact that we're doing different kinds of work.
yeah. Hey friends, this is a good time to pause and let you know that Bright and Early is brought to you by Transistor.fm. Transistor offers you professional podcast hosting and analytics. They host this podcast, and I've said it before, y'all, it just could not be any easier. And if you're listening to this interview with Ryan Singer, chances are pretty good that you have heard of DHH, David Heinemeier Hansson, who recently mentioned on Twitter that they are moving the Rework podcast over to Transistor. The plan is to move to Transistor, says DHH. I feel pretty confident that MI Justin, that's Justin Jackson, and crew are not going to sell out to listener-targeted advertisement schemes. So that's just one reason. If you are thinking about starting a podcast, look no further than Transistor.fm. And if you decide to spin up a podcast with them, let them know that Brian sent you. I want to ask a specific question about something you share in the book. You share this anecdote of a time that Basecamp missed a rabbit hole in the
Mm,
shaping process,
hmm.
and none of you were able to find a suitable 6-week design solution,
Mhm.
and so you abandoned it.
Right.
How often um, how often does that still happen for your team? I'm kind of curious about an acceptable failure rate for teams who are just starting to implement this, to be like, are we still learning stuff happens, or whoa, we are fully busted and we got to figure this is well out of the range of acceptable.
That's a good question. If I just think back right now over the last few years, I only have 2 projects that come to mind where that happened.
Okay, wow.
So that's fairly rare. We are quite well practiced in all of this, so I'm not saying that that should be the standard to measure oneself by. I think the bigger question is, um, are we more often, um, shipping things that we bet on? Because all it takes, honestly, I've seen this in companies who have been early adopters of ShapeUp. All it takes is one project where 6 weeks go by and the thing ships and everyone is really proud of it, and the designers and programmers were more engaged in the past than in the past because they had more latitude, and it was shaped so everybody knew kind of how to focus their energy together. Like, one of those projects will reset everybody's expectations about what success feels like. You finish one of those projects and you're like, man, that was awesome. And what you want to do is reproduce that success again.
Hmm.
And so from time to time, you're going to have the next one, and then you're going to flub something, and it's like, oh, we missed that, or we didn't understand that, or we kind of rushed and we didn't totally shape that, right? And then it doesn't quite go off as well, and you're like, oh, well, what did we do? What can we do better next time? Because here's the thing: software companies are wasting so much time and burning so many hours building the wrong things, and dealing with technical debt and all kinds of things that come from working in a way that isn't working, that if once in a while, a 6-week project doesn't quite work, and and you either are on the downhill and you invest another 2-3 weeks, and then you get through it, or you identify a major rabbit hole in it and you table it and you do something else, and then that next thing ships in six
Hmm.
weeks I mean, think about it. You had a little bit of a rocky 6 weeks. You take a cool down, you pick off something that's better shaped, and then 6 weeks again, you have this huge success where everybody's like, "Wow, man, we finished it, and we're proud of it, and we did it. That was great." That it's. I just want to emphasize kind of how big the successes are, and then because you have the language and the ability to articulate sort of what went wrong, you can look back at a project that doesn't go right. You can say, was it because of the constraints that we created, or was it because of the performance of the team that was working within those constraints? Now we can start to untangle the problems when we're doing the troubleshooting to figure out what actually went wrong here.
Hmm.
Did
Yeah.
we miss something in the concept, or was there something that we expected the team to execute that turns out that they didn't? And did we schedule the wrong person, or is there a performance issue we have to figure out, or did we just make a bad bet, right? And now you can go back, and that feedback loop doesn't just loop back on the same team who kind of had a big committee meeting to figure out what to do, and now it's everybody's fault and nobody's fault.
Yeah.
Now we can say, that was a shaping issue. Who shaped this? Or that was a betting issue. Who decided that these were the people who were going to do the work on this? Or
Hmm.
that was an execution issue. Like, what happened with this programming decision, right?
Right.
And now these times where we get into trouble, they can feel more productive.
Yeah, absolutely. So I want to talk. I want to ask a question about betting and how that works. So just real quickly, like after something has been shaped, it's taken to the betting table
Hmm.
where the shaper pitches, describes the problem and the solution, and do we want to work on this, etc. You have this line in the book. Um, that is basically, what if the pitch was great, but the timing wasn't right? Well, anyone who wants to advocate it or advocate for it simply tracks it independently and then lobbies for it again six
Yes.
weeks later.
Hmm.
That makes perfect sense. And that has the feeling of something that just works. on
Hmm.
a well-functioning team, like when you say they simply track it independently, that just works on a well-functioning team, but would require processes and politics in low-trust teams. So,
I actually think
or rather, that's my assumption. What are your thoughts on
that's
that?
an excellent question, and I actually think it's the opposite. So, and let me say why. Um, when you have a centralized backlog, okay, what happens is somebody somebody who is in a position in the company to make bets. So somebody who owns resources,
Yep.
right,
Yep.
looks at that backlog and they see a menu of possibilities. Maybe we'll do this, maybe we'll do that,
Mhm.
maybe we'll do the other thing. Everybody else in the company who's not in a betting position looks at that backlog and sees failure, because to them all of this stuff is supposed to happen
And they haven't done it yet.
and it hasn't gotten done, and we suck. Like, how are we ever going to do all this stuff? And look at all the stuff that we haven't gotten done. And 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 not only that, it's a it creates a credibility drain, and it creates bad politics, because what happens is when people can't agree about what to do, what do they say? Put it on the backlog.
Mm.
So everybody learns that putting it on the backlog actually means we couldn't agree, and it means it'll probably never happen. But at the same time, it's on there, so we sort of feel like we're supposed to do it, and everybody feels squeezed and uncomfortable and bad about looking at this thing. So actually having a public centralized backlog that everybody can see creates all these bad feelings, versus having a private list that a person who's in a position to who's responsible to lobby for a project, or who is in a position to actually commit the resources, that's just a useful asset to them. Maybe I could do this, maybe I could do that. But when you have a private list, you don't need to have these stupid grooming meetings where everyone is wasting hours having a debate about how to prioritize stuff. It's a
Yeah.
completely different dynamic. So
Yeah.
what we want is, if we've got two or three people, let's say, in a very small company, um, who are sort of responsible for figuring out what to do next, let's say, those people can have some sticky notes on their desk. They could have some stuff scribbled on their whiteboard in their office. They could have a notepad. They could have a little to-do list in their own to-do list app of their choosing. And they don't have to have a grooming meeting. All they do is just scratch something down that they think comes back to the top of their mind, like, oh, maybe that next, right?
Mhm.
And then if somebody does some shaping work and pitches a project and then brings it to the betting table, like you mentioned, and for some reason it's not the right time to do it, that person can keep that at the top of their list of, like, okay, I'm going to wait for the right moment and then I'm going to try again.
'Kay.
Then when that happens, that work is being held on to somehow by the person who actually cares, in a way that doesn't create any sort of a bad feeling among the rest of the company, that, like, why haven't we done this yet? Because they haven't even heard about it yet, probably, you know? And then when the time is right, they bring that to the table instead of other things. So it's almost like an automatic, it's like you get grooming for free by decentralizing it, because everybody
Interesting.
just brings their own top priority to the
Yeah.
table.
Yeah.
And then when it comes to the table, it's not something on a queue that you're trying to read back what the description of it was. It's something that's in context, where and there's a person there who's standing for the idea and who has been thinking about it to represent it.
Right.
So it's a completely different dynamic. And this is actually the dynamic where you can have more trust, because if somebody says, hey, I think we should do X, instead of saying, okay, put it on the backlog, you say, oh, let's talk about that. I don't really understand that. Or, yeah, we've talked about that in the past. Let's see, maybe one day. And you don't write it down. And by not writing it down in a public place, you don't make a false commitment to anybody. It's more trustworthy to not follow through on a suggestion. That you know what I mean? It's more trustworthy, if you're not actually going to commit to do it, to just write it down on your personal notepad instead of putting it on the wall.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah. I wanna we only have a few minutes left, so I wanna ask a question. if you have any advice or tips for um, very small teams who are trying to implement shape up because they may be the ones who are doing both the shaping
Totally.
and the bedding
Yeah.
and the building, because
Right.
you have, okay, so these different 6-week processes. How would myself and my co-founder both have a 6-week process of shaping, getting the pitch ready, pitching it to ourselves, and then bedding and building?
So that's a great question because, like you said in the beginning, everybody does everything.
Mhm.
And it's only when you reach a certain scale that you actually put a formal process into place. So I would even say that even the 6-week cycle might not be a good idea when you're just 3 people starting off. I would say throw away everything that is a sort of a strict process in the book, and instead look at the facts of the universe. So shaped work has a different outcome than unshaped work.
Yes.
Making deliberate bets on things gives you more strategic clarity than just kind of chasing after every request that comes up,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
Looking at what's known and unknown will help you to make better sequencing decisions and manage risk better than looking at what's complete and incomplete. So these are just facts about how things are.
Yeah.
If you internalize these facts, then what you can do is you can say, well, before we bet on this work, how do we feel? Do we feel like we know what it is? You say, oh, no, we don't really know. Well, let's not go in blind and then have this thing and then not be clear what it is once we start, right? So let's shape this a little bit. So then what you do is you just alternate. You take a little break from building something and you spend a little time shaping something,
Mhm.
right? And then when something's shaped, then you say, okay, this is good enough to go. And it might be more appropriate, for a tiny startup team of 3 people or something, to work without cycles at all and just set arbitrary fixed time boxes and say our appetite for this thing is 3 weeks,
Yeah.
and
Yes.
and we shaped it to 3 weeks, and we're going to work on this thing for 3 weeks, and then we're going to go shape something else.
Yep. Yeah, so the small batches and the big batches you talk about in the book, 2 weeks and 6 weeks, small teams, don't make that a dogma. The value of that is those are numbers that help you set an appetite that you then agree to. A circuit breaker switches in to keep you
Yep,
from continue to, like, sunk cost fallacy and throwing
exactly.
bad money or bad time after bad.
Yep.
But the prescription of 2 weeks and 6 weeks as the cycles, you think, set that aside if you need to, if
Hmm.
that's what works for your team.
Definitely.
Okay.
And I'm so glad that you asked that because this the I'm in the lucky position that when I get invited onto podcasts like this, I get these really great questions, and then I get to discover things that are missing in the book. So I'm absolutely going to go back to the book and add something about um, how the different practices are scale dependent, but how the facts are not, you know. And
Yeah, interesting.
if you're a team of 3, then 6 weeks, 2 weeks isn't necessarily true, but shaping versus unshaped will still give you a good or a bad outcome regardless of how you schedule that in
Right on.
and how you distribute that responsibility among the team.
Mhm.
And we're also seeing uh, I'm seeing companies actually who are on the other end who are really, really, really big, who have hundreds and hundreds of people on the development team in a bigger organization of thousands, and they're using ShapeUp, and they have similar questions. I mean, different questions, but of the same type in the way that it's saying, "Hey, I think that this all makes sense, but at my scale, what about X, Y, Z?" You
Yeah.
know, and
Yep.
they're solving those things as well. So there's definitely something that I want to figure out how to articulate about when you're. It's actually not that complicated. It's just a question of, you know, it's hard when you write a book because you make this big push and you get the thing out, and then you say, okay, well, uh, fortunately, because it's still on the web and it's digital, I can say, all right,
Yeah.
I'm gonna open the hood again and get in there and make this improvement.
Yeah.
But I think it'd be worthwhile. I really appreciate the chance to sort of improvise and work out these answers, by talking to people and then having these questions and so on.
Great. Great. Well, thanks for coming on. My guest today has been Ryan Singer. You can follow him on Twitter. He is RJS. You can read Shape Up at basecamp.com/shapeup, and he blogs at feltpresent.com. Ryan, thanks so much for coming on the show. It was great to
Sure
talk to you.
thing. Maybe by the time your listeners read it, it'll have a new section in it about what to do when you're a team of 3.
Fantastic.
Let's see.
Good to meet you.
All right, take care.
Hey y'all, I've got a little bit of unexpected bonus content here. As Ryan and I were hanging up and I was thanking him for the call, I mentioned that I had read this book with a friend of mine who runs an agency, and being a contractor myself, my friend and I, we each find ourselves in situations where we are helping our clients build something brand new. Starting from nothing and going to something. And we were just kind of wondering how this process works for that sort of project. And I asked specifically, it doesn't seem like you could build Basecamp 3 with the shape up process described in the book. And so Ryan just kind of began to answer that question, and I tapped record because he was mentioning, this process won't work exactly as it's described to build something brand new. And so you don't miss much of what he was saying at the beginning. Where it's about to pick up is he's describing how it is just a little bit different as you get things started. So here is that answer.
Instead of having shape and then bet and then build, you make a bet for a period of time that we're just going to go explore, trying to get like a few main features somehow cobbled together. You don't actually shape it other than a really rough idea of what you want to do.
Mm-hmm.
And then the person who you schedule into that time box is mixing in a very blurry, messy way, shaping and building. They're going to shape what they're going to do for 3 days, and then they're going to try it, and it's not going to work, and they're going to shape something else, and they're going to try it. So it's going to be shaping and building are going to be totally integrated inside of that exploratory time box.
Yeah.
And then as they build, the main method is always saying like done means deployed. Like get the whole thing, build it to the point that you can ship it and all the way down top to bottom, and then move on. But if you're in this R&D mode, you actually want to build everything halfway. You want to build it just enough that you can tell that it's all going to hang together.
Mm. Like you want to build it to the top of the hill?
Yeah,
Like,
you want
that
to exactly,
right? Okay.
exactly. You want to get more or less to the top of the hill on each main tent pole piece of the product. Like in order for the product to be what it is, it sort of has to do this, that, and this, right?
Yeah.
And you want to sort of get to the point where you're more or less over the hill on like the data model for this and where that belongs in the interface and how do you navigate to that. And then you reach a point where it's all like sort of shoddy, but you're like, you know what, this holds together and I know what goes where.
Yeah.
Then now you have a sort of like really rough map. And now you can make bets and shape things to give to other people, because you can be like, look, this belongs over here.
Mm-hmm.
Go build this out.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, totally.
So that's the shift. And I tried to describe that in that appendix, more or less what I just said. And so if you're trying to build like a Basecamp 3, then what we did was we had, and we're doing it right now with another new product. We've gone through this a few times. We have a sort of the super team, you know, of the most senior people. You have like a designer and a programmer who are super, super senior, and they're sort of skunk work style doing this exploratory work where they're trying to figure out like how the main parts hang together. Then as soon as the architecture gets settled, then the ground is firm, and now you can go to send other teams in by doing shape, bet, build.
Yeah. So the difference in giving them the whole IKEA box with no manual and
exactly.
Hey, there's 2 boards and 8 screws in there.
Exactly.
That makes total sense, Ryan.
And there's still a lot of unknown, but that unknown is more bounded. It's not like everything is unknown. It's like, well, we kind of know it belongs over here, and it's more or less using this approach. You know what I mean? And we trust that if we task the team with solving this, like they'll come up with something that works, and we're not going to have to scrap it halfway through.
Okie dokie, let's do some closing thoughts here. I thought it was most interesting just how Ryan continued to refer back to these basic facts of the universe or basic facts about work, or that sort of term that he kept referring back to. Some of those being, things begin as raw ideas. There are going to be some surprises along the way. When you try to turn those raw ideas into a usable thing, you don't want to overspec it up front. Some boundaries are required. The process of going from raw idea to something worth betting on, that's a skill. That's work. And striking that balance between free for all, no process kid soccer and soul crushing Jira user stories is what they call shaping, like that process of finding the balance. I just think it's interesting the way he just continued to refer back to that, the idea to throw away things that are throw away everything that's a strict process. That the how did he put that the practices themselves are scale dependent, like 6-week cycle, 2-week cool down. Those specifics are scale dependent, but the basic facts about work are not scale dependent. They are facts. So I thought that was pretty fascinating. So like that, just the line, constraints change the definition of value of good and bad. Like that, the kind of referring to some jobs to be done language there around, hot dog and steak are both really good meals to have for dinner, depending upon what your constraints are. That's just a great approach, I think, to keep in mind with all of product design, and that philosophy is behind why they begin with an appetite and not with a design, and to allow the design. They do not allow the design to determine the time investment required. It's just a fascinating thing. I also the notion of making bets with a circuit breaker, that establishes a floor. If you are disciplined, then you cannot lose any more than you place in a single bet. That is so it's definitely easier said than done, but it makes so much common sense, like how many projects need to go over time and over budget before we adopt the idea of, hey, look, we are just no longer going to continue to fall victim to sunk costs, and one more week, we just need one more week. If you can be disciplined about it, then this idea of betting, and under no circumstances do you go over the bet, just makes complete sense. And if you get to the end of the timeline and you haven't shipped something and there's no way, well, then the circuit breaker trips, and you take the remaining work back to the betting table. And if it's worth investing in, then it continues to move forward. No doubt, lots of nuances in there, but as a general approach, as a general philosophy, just absolutely makes sense. In preparing for this interview, just kind of doing like a little bit of scouring around Twitter and seeing what people were saying about Shape Up, or commenting to Ryan, like what were people taking issue with, or having some questions outside of just the mechanics of where do you fit in bugs, which they've added. That happens at the cooldown period. Not just that, but some other notions about who does the shaping, who do the shapers answer to, what happens if consistently like bets are being made and people's preferences are being overlooked, et cetera, just those kinds of things. Those were the bits that were kind of behind a couple of my questions around, like, this feels, the process that you're describing here feels like it works with a high trust, high talent team, and maybe doesn't work so well with others. And that's definitely like the pattern that I continued to pick up on the more I was like digging around and finding, what were the bad reviews. Most of them have this like a scent of seeking too much certainty, too much process, and those things, in my opinion, are bad for morale, or at least I should say bad for morale among teams that value creativity over predictability. So both of those are good things. Creativity and predictability are both values, but placed like given an even overstatement, like I would value creativity over predictability. Some people, some teams would value predictability even over creativity. And neither of those are bad or good. That's just where do you value two very good things. And so I think something I've been kind of wondering about, or saying as I've been talking to other folks about the book. Most people who read Shape Up and then think this would never work for us, they are probably right, because it requires a certain type of team where leadership trusts design and development at a high level, and that trust is returned upward. Similarly, where things will fail, leadership will make decisions that other folks may disagree with. But if you trust that everybody is doing their best and, and assuming goodwill in every direction, this sort of thing will work and will probably be more fulfilling professionally than strict processes, tasks, checklists, and the paper shredder, as this is referred to in the book. I think this question about are we shipping things that we bet on being the primary question that you should be asking yourself along the way, just that made a ton of sense to me, because when the answer is no, like are we shipping things that we bet on? No, on a regular basis at least. That is when you can start to dig into, well, is that because we're not very good at shaping? We need to work on that process. Is it that we're betting on the wrong things, or are we shaping and betting things appropriately, but we have some issues in our build and our development, design and development process that we need to refine? That it feels like to me that is a good, qualitative measure, a good qualitative question that teams can be asking themselves. And so I think finally the last thing I want to say, or the last thought that I had, is just around the idea of backlogs, because this I just keep seeing this pop up all over the place. The idea of deleting your backlog, forget about it. Backlogs are bad. They're bad for morale. They make people feel terrible. And I think I guess my opinion here is, yeah, if you and your team are in a position where you just want to like highlight the backlog and delete it and move on, cool. If you're in a leadership position and that is not something that your team can do, I think it's at least worth saying out loud and agreeing as a group. The backlog is not a guilt log. This is our way of taking the pressure off of ourselves to store this stuff in our brain. Like we think that's equally bad. That's tiring. And so we don't want anyone to be looking at the backlog, feeling bad about yourself because you haven't gotten to all of this yet, because we haven't shipped it. That's not what this is about. This is a place where we are cataloging ideas that we are receiving internally and externally, because it's hard to remember things. And so this is just our way of getting it out. So, yeah, that's my short rant on the deleting your backlog issue. I would love to hear what you think about this interview. If you have any thoughts, you can find me on Twitter. I am BRHEA. That is B as in bulbous, R as in rhombus, H as in hexagon, E as in equilateral, and A as in angle. If you are a founder or executive at a startup and you need some help designing, developing, or even maybe shaping your product, you can feel free to reach out to me at brian@brianray.com or hit me up on Twitter. I would love to chat and see if there's a way that we can work together. If you are listening to this podcast and it adds some value to your week, please just scroll down on your little podcast app there and leave a 5-star rating and review. Really helps people to find the show. And as always, thank you so much for listening, and I'll talk to you next week.